It is an unusual thing, after all these years of chronicling my dear friend Sherlock Holmes' singular exploits, to confess that one case, just one, left me with a lingering sense of unease, an uncanny sensation that perhaps, for the first time, we had brushed against forces beyond our mortal understanding. I would not have entertained such a notion had it not been for the strange affair of the ancient book, an artifact so peculiar in its nature, so precise in its deceptions, that even Holmes himself, for the briefest of moments, betrayed the smallest flicker of doubt. The matter came to us in the autumn of 1897, during those grey and restless months when Holmes, with no immediate case to occupy his formidable intellect, had become intolerably withdrawn. He would spend long hours in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, his eyes closed in some deep, unfathomable meditation. It was during one such evening, when the gas lamps cast flickering shadows upon the bookshelves and the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows provided our only company, that the mystery began. Little did I suspect, as I glanced over my newspaper that evening, that we stood upon the precipice of one of the most inexplicable cases ever to pass through the doors of 221B Baker Street. And yet, as always, it was Holmes himself who sensed the first tremors of the approaching storm, his razor-sharp mind attuned to the faintest whisper of the extraordinary. I had, in my naive certainty, believed that no mere book could shake the confidence of the world's greatest detective. But that night, as I would soon discover, there existed a volume capable of challenging even Sherlock Holmes himself. Holmes had been silent for hours, his tall frame half-shadowed in the dim light of our sitting room. The air was thick with the scent of burning tobacco. His pipe, long since cooled, still rested between his fingers. Across from him, upon the small side table, lay a singular object, a heavy, leather-bound book, its cover worn with age, the gold lettering faded to the point of obscurity. He had not so much as acknowledged my presence since supper, nor had he touched his violin, his usual means of distraction during such periods of restlessness. Instead, his keen grey eyes were fixed upon the book, scanning each page with an intensity that, for Holmes, was unusual even by his own extraordinary standards. "Holmes," I said at last, setting down my paper, "if I did not know you better, I might suspect that you had found a puzzle worthy of your abilities. That book, what is it?" For a long moment, he did not reply. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he turned a single page, his expression betraying the slightest trace of something I could not quite place. Was it curiosity? No, it was something deeper, something I had rarely seen before. "Watson," he murmured, his voice lower than usual. "Tell me, what would you say if I informed you that this book contains an account of every case I have ever solved?" I frowned. "A compilation, then. Someone has taken to documenting your exploits, much as I have done." "Not quite." His fingers traced the delicate edge of a page. "This book, this precise volume, was printed over 100 years ago." I felt a chill brush against me, a cold, inexplicable thing that had nothing to do with the draught from the window. "Impossible," I said. Holmes merely smiled, though there was no amusement in his eyes. Before I could press the matter further, a sudden, frantic pounding at the door startled us both. Mrs. Hudson's startled exclamation echoed from below, followed by hurried footsteps upon the stairs. A moment later, the door to our sitting room burst open, and a man stumbled inside, drenched in rain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was a man of advancing years, his silvered hair dishevelled, his spectacles askew upon the bridge of his nose. His tweed coat was soaked through, and his gloved hands trembled as he clutched at the doorframe. But it was his expression that struck me most. The wild, almost fevered look in his eyes, as if he had seen something beyond comprehension. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "you must listen to me. The book is real." Holmes had risen from his chair, his gaze sharp, assessing. "Come in, Professor Hawthorne," he said smoothly. "It seems you have made quite the journey to reach us." The man staggered forward, collapsing into the chair I had vacated. He dragged a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped at his damp forehead. "Forgive my intrusion," he panted, "but I had no choice. I have seen something. Something that should not be possible." "Take your time, Professor," I said gently. "You are among friends." He nodded, swallowing hard before leaning forward. "I am a historian," he began. "My work often takes me to the depths of the British Museum's archives. 2 nights ago, I was cataloguing a collection of rare manuscripts when I came upon this." He reached into his coat and withdrew a second book, identical to the one upon Holmes's table. He placed it down with a reverence I might have reserved for a religious artifact. Holmes glanced between the 2 volumes, his eyes gleaming with interest. "And what precisely is it that troubles you, Professor?" Hawthorne inhaled sharply. "Mr. Holmes, this book details every case you have ever solved, but it was written centuries before you were even born." A heavy silence settled over the room. Even Holmes, for once, did not immediately respond. It was in that moment that I realized, whatever lay ahead of us, it would be unlike anything we had ever encountered before. I must confess that even after all the years spent in Holmes's company, there were few cases that truly shook my sense of reality. This, however, was one such occasion. Professor Hawthorne, still visibly shaken, lifted the ancient volume with the care one might afford a sacred relic. Holmes, his keen eyes narrowed in scrutiny, took the book from the man's trembling hands and turned the pages with deliberate precision. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The paper is indeed of considerable age, the binding consistent with 18th century craftsmanship. And yet, you claim its contents pertain to matters far more recent." Hawthorne nodded feverishly. "Not just recent, Mr. Holmes. Impossible. This book," he tapped the brittle parchment, "contains a chronicle of every case you have ever solved, the names, the places, even the very words you have spoken. It is all here." I leaned forward, incredulous. A hoax, surely, some meticulous forger with too much time on his hands. Holmes's expression remained unreadable as he turned another page. "Perhaps," he said. "And yet, look here, Watson, your own words, recorded verbatim from the Boscombe Valley affair. Tell me, do you recall ever publishing this precise exchange?" I frowned. "No, certainly not." Hawthorne's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then how could it be written here, in ink that has long since dried?" A chill passed over me as Holmes turned to the final pages. My heart quickened as I saw his brows arch ever so slightly, a rare sign of genuine intrigue. For there, in precise, unwavering script, was an entry that had not yet come to pass. Holmes read the passage aloud, his voice calm, measured, though I sensed the faintest undercurrent of something deeper, something rare. Hesitation. "On this night, before the clock strikes 12, a murder shall be committed within the study of Sir Reginald Ashcombe. The blade shall find its mark, and the great detective Sherlock Holmes shall stand accused." A hush fell upon the room. The words, penned long before the night's events, seemed to press upon us with an unnatural weight. "It names the victim," I said hoarsely. "It names you." Hawthorne's hands clenched the arms of his chair. "I came to you at once, Mr. Holmes. If this book is to be believed, a man will die before the hour is out, and you shall be held responsible." For a moment, Holmes simply sat there, fingers steepled, eyes fixed upon the aged parchment. Then, with his usual composure, he snapped the book shut and rose to his feet. "Well, Watson," he said, reaching for his coat, "it seems we have a most pressing appointment." And with that, the game was afoot. The air was thick with the damp chill of a London evening as we stepped out into the waiting hansom cab. Holmes, ever composed, settled into his seat, his fingers laced together in quiet contemplation. Professor Hawthorne, on the other hand, remained in a state of visible distress, his hands trembling as he wiped his brow with a crumpled handkerchief. "It is absurd," I muttered as we set off. A book that foretells crimes before they occur. It is a contradiction in terms. Holmes's gaze flickered toward me, the faintest glint of amusement in his eyes. You surprise me, Watson. Have we not seen 100 contradictions in our time? The locked room that was not locked, the dead man who was very much alive, and now a history written in advance of the event. Why should this be any different? Because, I said firmly, it defies all reason. Holmes inclined his head. Reason, my dear Watson, is a delicate instrument. It is only as sound as the facts upon which it is based, and at present we have too few to declare this matter one way or the other. Professor Hawthorne clutched at his coat. You must believe me, Mr. Holmes. The book is a most intriguing artifact, Holmes finished smoothly, and as such, it is deserving of investigation. Tell me, Professor, who else has seen it? No one, Hawthorne replied. At least, no one to whom I have shown it. It was hidden in the depths of the museum's archives, locked away in a vault that has remained sealed for over a century. Holmes raised an eyebrow. And yet, someone knew to include a fresh entry only hours ago. A visible shudder passed through the professor. Precisely why I came to you. Holmes leaned back, his expression unreadable. Then let us hope, for Sir Reginald's sake, that we have arrived in time. The cab rattled through the narrow streets, each turn bringing us closer to the old Royal Library and to the mystery that awaited within. The old Royal Library loomed before us, its towering facade swallowed by the encroaching fog. A chill seeped into my bones as we stepped inside, the great iron doors groaning on their hinges. It was a place of deep silence. The high domed ceiling disappeared into shadow, the flickering glow of gas lamps casting long, wavering shapes upon the marble floors. The faint rustle of pages, turned by unseen hands, was the only sound, save for the slow, measured steps of the night librarian who emerged from the gloom. Miss Whitby, Holmes greeted her, removing his hat with a courteous nod. Still keeping London scholars in check at this hour? Eleanor Whitby, a severe-looking woman of perhaps 50, regarded us with an air of quiet disapproval. Mr. Holmes, I should have expected as much. You have the advantage of me, madam. She exhaled sharply. No one comes here at this hour unless they are up to mischief or hunting it. Holmes chuckled. Quite so. We require access to the restricted archives. Her lips pursed. Impossible. That section has been sealed for decades. Professor Hawthorne cleared his throat. With respect, madam, I retrieved a volume from that very section not 2 nights past. Miss Whitby stiffened. That cannot be. No one has entered that vault in over 100 years. Holmes turned to me with an expression of quiet triumph. Watson, I believe we have found our first inconsistency. Miss Whitby hesitated. The archives were examined last year, but the vault itself remained undisturbed. If the book truly came from within, then someone has been where they ought not to be, Holmes finished. Would you be so kind as to fetch the key? She regarded him warily, but, after a long pause, turned and disappeared into the corridors beyond. Holmes wasted no time. His eyes swept the vast reading hall, lingering briefly on the few scholars who remained hunched over their tomes. At length, he nodded towards a shadowed alcove near the second level. Watson, he murmured, observe the upper gallery. I followed his gaze. A figure, a tall man, hooded and still, stood half hidden behind the stone balustrade. The moment our eyes met, he vanished. Holmes exhaled through his nose. It seems we are not the only ones interested in this book. A sense of foreboding settled over me. Somewhere in the depths of this great, hollow place, a crime was waiting to unfold. And we, unknowing, had stepped straight into its path. Miss Whitby returned with a ring of keys, her expression betraying a tension that had not been present before. She hesitated a moment, then placed the cold metal in Holmes's outstretched hand. I do not like this. she murmured. That book. It should never have left the vault. I told them it was best left undisturbed. Holmes twirled the keys idly between his fingers. And yet, it has been disturbed, Miss Whitby. Tell me, who else has access to the restricted section? No one, she replied at once. At least, no one who should. The archives were sealed long before my time, and I have always ensured that they remain so. And yet, Holmes mused, you speak of it as if the book is something unnatural. Miss Whitby folded her arms. Mr. Holmes, I have worked in this library for nearly 30 years. I know the weight of the past when I see it. That book, when I first laid eyes on it, I had the distinct sensation that it had been waiting for someone, as if it wanted to be found. A chill passed through me at her words, though Holmes, ever composed, merely inclined his head. Superstition, Miss Whitby, is the enemy of reason. I believe we shall find that the book's origins are far more earthly in nature. She gave him a long look. I would be careful all the same, Mr. Holmes. There are some things even reason cannot explain. Holmes, unimpressed by her foreboding tone, merely gestured for her to lead the way. The iron gate creaked as she unlocked it, revealing the darkened depths of the restricted archives. I followed Holmes inside, though I could not shake the feeling that we had stepped beyond the realm of the ordinary and into something far stranger. The air was thick with the scent of parchment and age, the dust of centuries undisturbed until now. Holmes took his time as he examined the chamber, his keen eyes flickering over the ancient shelves and their forgotten tomes, before settling upon the book in Professor Hawthorne's hands. Now, he said, extending a hand, let us see precisely what manner of deception we are dealing with. The professor hesitated before relinquishing it, as if reluctant to part with the thing. Holmes laid it flat upon a wooden table and turned the brittle pages with delicate precision, his gaze sharpening with every movement. Fascinating, he murmured. The script is inconsistent. Do you see, Watson? Here, in the earlier entries, the hand is refined, practiced. Yet as we progress, the writing grows cruder, more hurried. It is as if the author has changed midway through the work. I peered over his shoulder. Could it not simply be the work of multiple scribes? Possible, Holmes admitted. And yet look here. He pointed to the final entry, the one foretelling Sir Reginald's murder. The ink, Watson. It has not yet fully dried. Hawthorne stiffened. That cannot be. The book has been locked away for over a century. And yet, Holmes said coolly, someone has added to it within the past few hours. A silence settled over us. My own thoughts raced. If the book had been sealed away, untouched, then how could a fresh entry have appeared? Either someone had access to the archives and had been tampering with it recently, or the book was never as ancient as it seemed. Holmes turned a few more pages, his expression thoughtful. The question, gentlemen, is not how this book has recorded past events with such precision, but rather, who is using it now to dictate the future? The weight of his words settled upon us, heavy with implication. Somewhere, hidden behind these pages, lay the mind of a criminal who had engineered this elaborate deception. And if we did not uncover their identity soon, another murder, one written in ink not yet dry, would come to pass before the night was out. Holmes's sharp gaze remained fixed on the upper gallery, where the shadow had flickered and vanished. He turned to me with a calm that belied the tension in the air. We are being observed, Watson. I followed his gaze, but the space above was now empty. The great reading hall stretched around us, its vast shelves and towering alcoves offering ample places for a man to disappear. Did you see him clearly? I asked. Holmes shook his head. Number. But the manner of his retreat suggests familiarity with the building. He knew precisely where to step, where the light would not touch him. A practiced hand, I should think. Professor Hawthorne swallowed audibly. You believe someone is following us? Holmes regarded him with a look of mild amusement. My dear Professor, someone has been following this book long before it reached our hands. The question is, why did they reveal themselves now? Miss Whitby clutched at the folds of her dress. This is why I warned you. Some things should be left alone. Holmes ignored her and turned his attention back to the table. His fingers traced the cover of the book, his mind already several steps ahead of us. We now have two peculiar facts, he murmured. First, the book, which has recorded history with uncanny precision, contains an entry that has yet to occur. Second, an unknown party has been shadowing us since we arrived at the library. He closed the book with a soft thud and straightened. If my deductions are correct, gentlemen, we are no longer dealing with a curiosity. We are dealing with an active plot, one that must be set in motion before the hour is out. A chill passed through me at his words. Somewhere in London, a man was marked for death, and the only evidence of the crime existed in ink upon a page. Holmes retrieved his pocket watch, glanced at the time, and turned briskly to Hawthorne. "Professor, you mentioned the name of the intended victim." Hawthorne nodded, his voice unsteady. "Sir Reginald Ashcombe." Holmes let out a short breath, his expression unreadable. "Interesting," I started. "You know him?" "Indeed, Watson. Sir Reginald Ashcombe is a man of considerable influence, a former diplomat with no shortage of political adversaries. But more to the point." Holmes tapped the book's cover. "His death is recorded here as occurring before midnight, which leaves us little time to act." Hawthorne's face paled. "You believe the murder will actually take place?" Holmes turned his piercing gaze upon him. "I believe, Professor, that someone wants it to take place. And if they have gone to such lengths to predict it, I am not inclined to let them succeed." I felt the tension tighten in my chest. "Then we must go to Sir Reginald at once." Holmes nodded. "Precisely, Watson. The game has begun." We were in the hansom cab within minutes, Holmes rapping twice against the ceiling to urge the driver onward. The streets of London blurred past us, gas lamps casting pale light upon the wet cobblestones. I stole a glance at my watch, 11:30. "Holmes, what if we are too late?" I asked. Holmes remained motionless, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. "Then we shall have a very different mystery upon our hands, Watson." Professor Hawthorne, seated opposite us, wrung his hands anxiously. "But what if the book is right?" Holmes's eyes flickered toward him. "It is not a question of whether the book is right, Professor. It is a question of who wrote that final entry and why they wish us to believe it." The cab took a sharp turn, and I steadied myself against the window. "Sir Reginald," I murmured, "if he is truly in danger, he must be warned." Holmes gave a short nod. "If he is still alive, Watson, we shall see to it that he remains so. If he is not—" He hesitated, which was unlike him. "Then we must determine what unseen hand holds the quill that writes his fate." Neither of us spoke after that. The only sound was the steady clatter of hooves against stone as we rushed toward the unknown. The cab rattled through the streets at a breakneck pace, Holmes urging the driver onward with sharp commands. The urgency in his tone left no room for delay, and though he sat motionless, his mind was undoubtedly racing. "Watson," he said at last, "what do you make of this so-called prophecy?" I hesitated. If the book's accuracy is to be believed, Sir Reginald's life hangs in the balance. We may already be too late. Holmes gave a curt nod. "And yet, if that were the case, why record the crime before it occurs? The book has been precise in its accounts, yes, but only in matters that have already transpired. This, however, is different." "You think it was written to mislead us?" "I think," he said, "that it was written to ensure that we arrive at precisely the right or wrong moment." Professor Hawthorne, his hands gripping his knees, let out an uneasy breath. "But if the book is false, then Sir Reginald may not be in danger at all." Holmes shook his head. "No, Professor. Whether the book is a fabrication or not, the danger is very real. Someone has orchestrated this with great care, and we must discover whether we are arriving to prevent a crime or to witness one. The cab lurched as it turned onto a quiet street lined with grand residences. Sir Reginald's townhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark, its iron gate ajar. Holmes did not wait for the cab to stop before leaping down. "Quickly, Watson, every moment counts." I followed without question, my pulse quickening. Holmes's hand was already on the door knocker, his movements swift and certain. But as he struck it against the wood, the only answer was silence. Holmes exchanged a glance with me, then tried the handle. The door swung open without resistance. "Unlocked," he murmured. Unwise for a man in fear of his life. And with that, he stepped inside. The house was eerily still, the dim glow of a single lamp flickering in the entrance hall. Holmes moved forward, his sharp gaze scanning the surroundings. The silence pressed in around us, thick and unnatural. "Sir Reginald?" I called out. No answer. Holmes moved swiftly, his steps precise, his ears attuned to the slightest sound. We proceeded down the hall, past the grand staircase, and into a corridor lined with heavy oak doors. At the far end, a faint glow seeped beneath one of them. Holmes stopped short. That must be his study. He advanced, pressing his ear against the wood. His expression darkened. No movement within. He turned the handle, but the door refused to yield. "Locked from the inside," I muttered. Holmes stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "Watson, do you smell that?" I inhaled sharply. A faint, acrid scent lingered in the air. Smoke? No, something sharper, metallic. A scent I had encountered too many times on battlefields and crime scenes alike. "Blood," I murmured. Holmes's jaw tightened. "Stand back." Before I could question him, he had drawn back his foot and struck the door near the lock with precise force. The wood splintered, and on the second blow, the door gave way. The scene within was one of horror. Sir Reginald Ashcombe sat slumped in his chair, his head bowed, his hands limp at his sides. A dagger protruded from his chest, its hilt adorned with an ornate crest. Blood stained his crisp white shirt, pooling beneath him in a dark, glistening tide. His sightless eyes stared at the floor, frozen in the moment of death. For a moment, none of us moved. The reality of it, the finality, settled upon us like a lead weight. Then Holmes strode forward, his expression unreadable. He bent over the body, his fingers grazing the dagger's hilt before withdrawing. "He has been dead no more than 30 minutes, he murmured. The book's prediction was accurate after all. A chill crept up my spine. "Holmes, this is impossible. How could it have known?" Holmes did not answer. His gaze had shifted to the desk, where a single object lay. A torn page from the ancient book. Upon it, written in bold ink, were the words, "Sherlock Holmes will be accused of murder." Holmes stood unmoving, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the grim tableau before us. I, however, felt the weight of the moment settle upon my chest like a lead weight. Sir Reginald Ashcombe was dead. The book's prediction had come to pass. I swallowed hard. Holmes. How could it have foreseen this? Holmes did not respond immediately. His gaze moved over the body with methodical precision, from the dagger embedded in Sir Reginald's chest to the torn page upon the desk. He bent slightly, studying the dagger's hilt without touching it. "This was no ordinary murder," he murmured at last. "Observe, Watson. The blade has been driven in with remarkable force, yet there is little sign of struggle. No overturned chair, no broken glass. Sir Reginald did not fight his assailant." Hawthorne let out an unsteady breath. "Then, he knew his killer?" Holmes's fingers hovered over the desk, just above the torn page. Perhaps. Or perhaps the attack was so swift that he had no opportunity to react. He straightened abruptly, his eyes flashing with something sharp and dangerous. But the greater question is this: how did his murderer know we would find him like this? My stomach clenched. "You think we were meant to discover him?" Holmes gave a single grave nod. Consider the sequence of events, Watson. The book led us here. The time of death aligns precisely with its prophecy. The page on the desk, he gestured toward it, was placed there deliberately, ensuring that our arrival coincides with the discovery of the body. I felt a creeping unease. Holmes, this means the killer had foreknowledge of the book's contents. Indeed, Holmes said, and that, Watson, is more alarming than the murder itself. Before I could respond, the distant sound of approaching footsteps reached my ears. They were swift, purposeful, the heavy tread of men accustomed to authority. Holmes exhaled through his nose. Ah, and so the next phase begins. The door burst open. A uniformed officer strode in, his gaze sweeping the room before landing upon us. A moment later, Inspector Lestrade stepped forward, his sharp, weathered face betraying a flicker of surprise. Well, well, he said, his voice edged with suspicion. Sherlock Holmes, I'd say you've got some explaining to do. Lestrade's eyes darted from Holmes to the lifeless form of Sir Reginald, and I saw at once that the circumstances of our presence did us no favours. Holmes remained perfectly composed. Inspector, he greeted smoothly, what an opportune moment for your arrival. Lestrade's brow furrowed. A moment too opportune, I'd say. We received an anonymous tip, just minutes ago, directing us to this house, to this very room. And what do we find? A man murdered, and you standing over the body. Hawthorne paled. This is madness. Mr. Holmes came here to prevent the crime. Lestrade's expression darkened. And yet here we are, a dead man, a fresh wound, and... His eyes flickered to the desk. What's this? He stepped forward and snatched up the torn page, his lips pressing into a hard line as he read the words aloud. Sherlock Holmes will be accused of murder. Silence filled the room. I felt a chill creep through me. Someone had orchestrated this with unnerving precision. Lestrade turned the page over. His frown deepened. There's more. Holmes held out a hand. May I? Lestrade hesitated, then handed him the sheet. Holmes scanned the text. His face betrayed no reaction, but when he spoke, there was a new edge to his voice. Watson, this is written in the same hand as the book. I inhaled sharply. Then, the killer has planned every step of this, Holmes finished. He turned to Lestrade. Tell me, Inspector, does it not strike you as rather convenient that the murderer took the trouble to document his crime in such a theatrical fashion? Lestrade's mouth was a thin line. Convenient or not, Holmes, I have a duty to perform. A man has been murdered, and your name is written in his blood. Two constables stepped forward. One withdrew a pair of manacles. Lestrade sighed. I have no choice, Holmes. You're under arrest. Holmes stood calmly, his hands still resting at his sides, as Lestrade regarded him with evident unease. The inspector was no fool. He had worked alongside Holmes too many times to take the scene before him at face value, yet duty compelled him to act. You understand, Holmes, Lestrade said, his voice quieter than before. I've no choice in the matter. Holmes inclined his head. Indeed, Inspector. You are merely following the dictates of your profession, as I follow mine. The difference, of course, is that mine involves preventing injustice rather than enforcing it. Lestrade exhaled sharply. And what would you have me do? Overlook a corpse, a weapon, and an accusation scrawled in blood. Holmes' lips twitched into something resembling amusement. I would have you do precisely as you are doing, Lestrade. A man in your position can afford neither bias nor hesitation. And yet, I suspect you feel the weight of this case more than most. Lestrade hesitated. His sharp eyes moved between Holmes, the body, and the damning evidence surrounding them. I've seen you untangle some devilish knots, Holmes, he admitted. And I can't say I believe you capable of murder. But with all this... He gestured toward the dagger. I need more than words. Holmes nodded. And I shall give you more than words, Lestrade. But first, allow me the courtesy of finishing the game before the final move is played. Lestrade set his jaw. I'll see what I can do. But his eyes betrayed the truth. Sherlock Holmes was walking a razor's edge, and even Lestrade might not be able to save him. Lestrade turned to the waiting constables. "Search the room, bag the evidence." One officer moved to the body, carefully extracting the dagger from Sir Reginald's chest. He turned it over in his hands, then frowned. "Inspector, the hilt. It's marked with fingerprints." Lestrade stiffened. "Whose?" The constable hesitated. "Mr. Holmes's, sir." A murmur rippled through the room. I took a step forward. "That's impossible. Holmes never touched the weapon." Holmes, however, remained untroubled. "Interesting," he said mildly. "Either I have developed a peculiar habit of handling murder weapons in my sleep, or someone has taken great pains to implicate me." Lestrade's lips pressed into a hard line. "There's more," the constable added, lifting Sir Reginald's limp hand. A page, torn from the book, clutched in his fingers. Holmes took the page from Lestrade's grasp and scanned it. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The writing is precise, the ink dry, yet the placement is too deliberate. A final act, staged for an audience." Lestrade let out a heavy breath. "Holmes, I need an explanation, and I need it now." Holmes glanced toward the torn page, the dagger, and the lifeless form of Sir Reginald. His grey eyes burned with calculation. "Patience, Lestrade," he said softly. "We are dealing with an adversary of the highest order, and they have made their first mistake." Holmes stood amidst the gathered officers, his expression betraying neither concern nor indignation. He observed the scene with the same analytical detachment he might afford a game of chess, as though the entire affair were merely another puzzle to be unravelled. "It is a rare occasion, Lestrade," he said at last, "when I find myself in the position of the accused rather than the investigator. A most novel experience, I must admit." Lestrade's face remained grim. "Holmes, this is no game. The evidence is against you." "Evidence," Holmes mused, rolling the word over his tongue. "A peculiar thing, evidence. In the wrong hands, it is a weapon as potent as any blade." He gestured toward the dagger. "This, for instance, its placement, its presentation, even the choice of victim. It has all been arranged with surgical precision. You must see that, Lestrade." The inspector hesitated, but only for a moment. "What I see," he said gruffly, "is a man murdered and your name written in his blood. You tell me what I should believe." Holmes's eyes flashed with something keen and knowing. "Believe this, Lestrade. I am not the intended victim here, nor is Sir Reginald. This entire scheme was devised with one purpose, to ensnare me. Every clue, every so-called piece of damning evidence was constructed not for the discovery of truth, but for the illusion of guilt." Lestrade rubbed his chin. "Then you're saying the real killer wanted you to be arrested?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Arrested, discredited, perhaps even removed from the board entirely. What better way to silence a man than to make him the villain of his own tale?" I exhaled sharply. "Then whoever orchestrated this must have access to the book." Holmes nodded. "And more than access, Watson. Intimate familiarity. The culprit is no mere forger, no casual deceiver. They knew precisely how to manipulate the narrative, how to use the illusion of inevitability to shape reality itself. That, Lestrade, is our true adversary." The inspector frowned. "And who exactly is that?" Holmes's gaze settled on the torn page, the inked prediction that had set this chain of events in motion. "That," he murmured, "is what I intend to find out." Holmes turned to Lestrade, his voice now carrying a quiet authority. "You have a duty to perform, Inspector. I do not expect you to discard your obligations, nor would I ask you to. But know this, if you take me in now, you are playing directly into the hands of the true mastermind. They have orchestrated this affair with such care that even my arrest is but another step in their grand design." Lestrade hesitated, and in that moment I saw the battle waging within him. He had spent years relying on Holmes's judgment, had watched him unravel the most tangled of cases with unwavering precision. And yet, the weight of the evidence pressed upon him, heavy and damning. Holmes took a step forward. "Give me 24 hours. That is all I ask. 24 hours to uncover the one person who could have written that final entry. The one person who holds the pen, and thus the power over this entire affair." Lestrade exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Then, with a reluctant nod, he muttered, "24 hours, Holmes. No more." Holmes smiled. "That, my dear Lestrade, is all the time I require." Holmes wasted no time. The moment Lestrade conceded his 24-hour reprieve, he turned to me with an intensity that left no room for hesitation. "Watson, we must return to Baker Street at once. There is no time to lose." Professor Hawthorne, still visibly shaken, stepped forward. "But, Mr. Holmes, what can possibly be done? The book's prediction has come to pass. Sir Reginald is dead, and now your own name has been tied to the crime. How do you fight against something that has already been written?" Holmes regarded him with a glint of amusement. "Professor, if I believed in the inevitability of words upon a page, I should have given myself up to Lestrade without protest. But I do not concern myself with what is written. I concern myself with the hand that holds the pen." As we rode back through the mist-laden streets, Holmes was silent, his fingers steepled in deep contemplation. At last he spoke. "Watson, the brilliance of this scheme lies not in the book's supposed prophecies, but in its ability to dictate actions. Each entry influences the choices of those who read it. The professor found it and was compelled to bring it to me. We read the final entry and rushed to Sir Reginald, unwittingly stepping into the trap laid before us. "But Holmes," I interjected, "if the book truly has that power, how do we use it to our advantage?" He turned to me with a rare flicker of excitement. "By writing a prophecy of our own, Watson. If the culprit has been guiding events through the words in that book, then we shall do the same. Only this time, the final entry will not serve their design, it will serve ours." I stared at him, realization dawning. "You mean to set a trap?" Holmes's lips curled into a smile. "Precisely, my dear Watson. And if I am not mistaken, by this time tomorrow, the author of this grand deception shall find themselves the subject of a rather unexpected chapter." The candle burned low on the desk at Baker Street as Holmes worked with unerring precision. He had taken the book from Hawthorne and, after studying the previous entries with care, lifted his pen and began to write. "This must be done flawlessly," he murmured. "The style, the ink, the weight of the hand, all must be indistinguishable from the original author's script." I watched as he composed each line with meticulous care. "Holmes, what exactly are you writing?" His expression remained unreadable. "A crime, Watson. One that shall unfold exactly as dictated in these pages. A murder carefully staged, whose victim shall be none other than Sherlock Holmes himself," I started. "You mean to feign your own death?" Holmes set down his pen. "Not quite. But if our unseen adversary has been orchestrating events to ensure my downfall, we must give them what they desire, under circumstances of my choosing." He tapped the freshly inked page. "This entry shall predict my death at a precise time and place. The true author will read it, and believing themselves the sole orchestrator of fate, will ensure that they are present to witness their triumph. And at that moment, Watson, we shall know them." "But how can you be certain they will act?" Holmes leaned back, his eyes gleaming with certainty. "Because, Watson, the great weakness of those who manipulate from the shadows is that they cannot resist bearing witness to their own genius. The author of this deception has remained hidden for too long. It is time they stepped into the light." As the ink dried upon the page, I could not shake the feeling that Holmes had laid not just a trap, but the final move in a game that only he had foreseen. The night was damp with mist as we took our positions at the designated location, an abandoned warehouse on the banks of the Thames, where Holmes had dictated that his own murder would take place. Lestrade stood beside me, his arms folded, his patience wearing thin. "Holmes had better be right about this," he muttered. "We're staking out a crime that hasn't even happened, based on a book that shouldn't exist." I glanced toward Holmes, who stood apart from us, silent and still as a statue. His gaze never wavered from the entrance, his every sense attuned to the moment when the trap would be sprung. "Have you ever known him to be wrong, Lestrade?" I asked quietly. Lestrade exhaled. "Number, but there's a first time for everything." The constables waited in the shadows, their orders clear. They were to let the suspect complete their task, to allow them to believe their deception was playing out exactly as written. Only when Holmes gave the signal would they move in. Holmes had designed every element of this performance with meticulous care. He had rewritten fate itself, and now we waited for the unseen hand that had sought to control the narrative to take the bait. Minutes passed. The world was silent, save for the distant lapping of water against the dock. Then, at last, from the gloom beyond the warehouse doors, a figure emerged. The figure was clad in a long hooded cloak, its face obscured in darkness. Moving with deliberate precision, it stepped forward, producing from its sleeve a slender object that gleamed faintly in the gaslight. A dagger, the very weapon that had been used to kill Sir Reginald. I felt Lestrade stiffen beside me. "He's following the script exactly," he whispered. Indeed, every motion was methodical, rehearsed. The figure approached the spot where Holmes was to fall, pausing only to withdraw something from its coat, a torn sheet of parchment, which it placed upon a crate. Even from a distance, I could see the inked words upon it. "The final case of Sherlock Holmes." Holmes remained utterly still, watching. The figure stepped closer, raising the dagger. "Wait," Holmes murmured. "Just one more moment." The dagger hovered in the air. Then, as the figure adjusted its grip, Holmes took a single step forward and spoke with quiet finality. "You are precisely where I expected you to be, Professor Hawthorne." The hooded figure froze, and in that instant, the trap was sprung. The constables surged forward at Holmes's signal, their boots thudding against the wooden floor as they seized the figure. A scuffle ensued, but the suspect, taken by complete surprise, was quickly subdued. Lestrade strode forward and yanked back the hood, revealing the pale, sweating face of Professor Elias Hawthorne. His eyes darted wildly, his chest rising and falling in panicked breaths. "You!" he gasped, staring at Holmes. "But the book!" Holmes regarded him with cool detachment. "The book led you precisely where I intended, Professor. Just as you intended to lead me." Hawthorne shook his head. "You don't understand. I had to do it. The book is real." Holmes's expression did not waver. A most fascinating delusion. But I fear the only record of importance this evening will be the one detailing your arrest. Lestrade stepped in, producing a pair of manacles. "Professor Elias Hawthorne, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Ashcombe." The professor sagged, the fight draining from him. As he was led away, I turned to Holmes. "You knew it was him all along?" "Of course, Watson," he said quietly. "After all, who else but the author would wish to control the ending?" Professor Hawthorne slumped in the constable's grasp, his face ashen, his eyes darting between us like a caged animal. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a sudden, desperate exhalation, he spoke. "You cannot understand, Holmes," he gasped. "The book, it was never meant to be discovered." Holmes regarded him coolly. "On the contrary, Professor, it was meant to be discovered at precisely the right moment. You wrote its final chapter with that very purpose in mind, did you not?" Hawthorne's lip trembled. "You don't know," Holmes cut across him. "I know that the book is a forgery, A masterful one, I grant you, but a forgery nonetheless. The inconsistencies in the handwriting, the varying ink compositions, the deliberate attempt to mirror historical records, all designed to create the illusion of prophecy. Hawthorne let out a shuddering breath. It had to be convincing. Indeed, said Holmes. And so it was, until you made one fatal miscalculation. Hawthorne's gaze flickered with fear. What miscalculation? Holmes smiled thinly. That I would be content to let another dictate my fate. A visible shudder passed through the professor. His hands clenched. I was so close, he whispered. So close to the perfect crime. Holmes folded his arms. But perfection, Professor, lies not in the plan, but in its execution. And yours, I fear, was flawed. Hawthorne's breath came in ragged gasps. He looked around wildly, as though seeking an escape where none existed. Then, at last, his shoulders sagged. I had no choice, he muttered. You must understand. I had no choice. Holmes arched an eyebrow. A curious defence. Murder is seldom the result of necessity, Professor, but rather of intent. Hawthorne let out a bitter laugh. Intent, Mr. Holmes? Then let me tell you my intent. He raised his chin, his voice steadier now. Sir Reginald Ashcombe was no innocent man. He was a blackmailer, a wretch who thrived on the ruin of others. For years, he held my life in his hands. Letters, documents, evidence that could have destroyed my career, my reputation. I begged him for mercy, but he had none to give. Lestrade scoffed. And so you killed him? Hawthorne's eyes flashed. Number I did something far more clever. I wrote his death before it happened. I wove a story so compelling that even you, Mr. Holmes, could not ignore it. I made you a character in a crime that had not yet occurred, knowing that you would follow the trail exactly as I had laid it out. Holmes nodded. And in the end, you sought to frame me. A brilliant stroke. Had it succeeded? Hawthorne's face twisted in frustration. But it didn't, did it? Holmes smiled. No, Professor, it did not. Holmes stood before the assembled company, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Lestrade, still gripping Hawthorne's arm, glanced at him expectantly. Well, Holmes, he said, I suppose now is the time when you explain how you saw through all this. Holmes inclined his head. Indeed, Inspector. It is often the case that the grandest illusions rely on the simplest of deceptions. Professor Hawthorne sought to manipulate not just the events of this case, but the very manner in which we perceive them. He understood one great truth, that men fear the unknown more than they fear the known. I listened, as captivated as anyone in the room. He created a fiction so elaborate, so meticulously woven into the past that it seemed impossible to dispute. A book, ancient in appearance, detailing cases yet to occur. What could be more compelling? And yet, from the moment I laid eyes upon it, I knew it to be false. Lestrade let out a snort. You knew? And you didn't say a word? Holmes smiled slightly. What good would it have done, Inspector? The Professor's scheme relied not upon the veracity of the book, but upon our willingness to believe in it. By feigning ignorance, I allowed the true author of the deception to grow confident, to make his final move. Hawthorne let out a bitter laugh. And I did, didn't I? Holmes ignored him and continued. Watson, you recall the moment you first saw the book. What was your immediate impression? I thought back. It seemed unnerving, too precise, as if it had been written by an unseen hand guiding our very actions. Holmes nodded. Precisely the effect Hawthorne intended. He did not rely on mere forgery. He crafted an experience, one that played upon our deepest uncertainties. Lestrade frowned. And how exactly did you prove it was all a sham? Holmes reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a single sheet of parchment. By isolating the fatal mistakes, he said simply. Holmes held up the sheet, allowing the candlelight to illuminate the inked words upon it. "This," he said, "is the final page of the book, the one predicting my own demise." Lestrade eyed it warily. "And?" Holmes tapped the margin. "Consider the ink. When Watson and I first examined the book, the final entry was still drying, and yet the previous pages had long since set. This tells us that the so-called prophecy was written only moments before it was discovered." Hawthorne let out a derisive chuckle. "That proves nothing. Perhaps the book is truly ancient, and I simply added a new entry to it." Holmes shook his head. "A fine attempt, Professor, but a flawed one. For the handwriting throughout the text is not consistent. Some entries are carefully penned, others hurried and uncertain. And here—" He turned a page, pointing to the faded script of an earlier case. "This ink is aged, yes, but the stroke betrays a modern hand. The variation is not the natural evolution of a single scribe's work over decades. It is the variation of a man struggling to imitate the past." Lestrade narrowed his eyes. "So you're saying Hawthorne wrote the entire thing?" Holmes nodded. "And not merely that. He tailored it with the knowledge of hindsight. Each case mirrored my past triumphs with unnatural precision. The dialogue, word for word, was lifted from accounts Watson himself had written. It was not a prophecy. It was a well-researched deception." I exhaled. Then the book never had power at all. "Power?" Holmes echoed. "It had all the power it needed. It made us believe, and that belief nearly cost us everything." Hawthorne sagged in the constable's grasp, defeated. "And what now?" he muttered. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Now, Professor, you shall see how history truly records this night." Hawthorne's shoulders sagged as the weight of his failure settled upon him. Lestrade, ever efficient, motioned for the constables to take him away. "Professor Elias Hawthorne," he declared, "you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Ashcombe and for the attempted framing of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You'll have plenty of time to write your next chapter behind bars." Hawthorne offered no protest. His clever scheme had unravelled before him, leaving him with nothing but the knowledge that he had been outplayed by the very man he sought to destroy. As they led him away, he cast one last glance at Holmes. "You think you've won," he muttered. "But some stories never truly end." Holmes gave a slight, knowing smile. "Perhaps not, Professor. But it is the author, not the story, who finds himself undone tonight." Lestrade exhaled, shaking his head. "Holmes, I don't know how you do it. I was ready to lock you up myself." "A most regrettable misstep, Inspector," Holmes said with a smirk. "But I trust you will make amends by ensuring that our dear Professor Hawthorne receives the proper recognition for his rather imaginative literary pursuits." With Hawthorne in custody, Holmes's name was cleared, and the web of deception he had so carefully untangled now lay in ruins. But even as the matter drew to a close, I could not shake a lingering unease, one that Holmes himself did not seem eager to dispel. As we left the scene, I could not suppress the question that had been weighing upon me. "Holmes," I said at last, "was there ever a moment when you doubted yourself? When you considered, even for the briefest instant, that the book might truly have held some power beyond rational explanation?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He walked with his usual measured stride, his hands clasped behind his back. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, he replied, "We are creatures of perception, Watson. The mind sees what it wishes to see, and belief is a force more powerful than truth itself. If I had allowed myself to entertain the idea that my fate was written in those pages, then indeed it might have been." I frowned. "Then you admit the possibility that the book dictated reality?" Holmes interjected. "No, Watson. Only that the greatest deception is not what is written upon a page, but what we choose to accept as inevitable." His words lingered with me long after we had left the scene behind. The fire crackled in the hearth, of 221B Baker Street as Holmes sat in his chair, lost in thought. I watched him, the shadows dancing across his face, and at last I spoke. "You never truly feared the book, did you?" Holmes exhaled a thin wisp of smoke from his pipe. "Fear, Watson, is but an admission of ignorance, and ignorance, I find, is always correctable." He tapped the arm of his chair lightly. Hawthorne sought to construct an illusion so complete that even the greatest minds would bend to its will. He understood that men do not fear what they know, but what they think they know. I considered his words, and yet there was something unsettling about the whole affair, the way events unfolded so precisely, almost as if I trailed off, shaking my head. Holmes chuckled. "You see? Even now, the story lingers in your mind, nudging at the edges of reason." He leaned forward. "Watson, never forget. A well-told lie can be more powerful than the truth, but in the end, it remains a lie." And with that, he fell silent, his gaze fixed upon the fire. As I prepared to retire for the night, my eyes drifted to the old leather-bound book upon the table. It had been dismissed as a fraud, its entries exposed as mere fabrications. And yet, as I reached for it, I felt a peculiar hesitancy. "Holmes," I murmured, "what shall we do with it?" He did not look up from his violin. "You may dispose of it if you wish, Watson. The tale is concluded, its purpose fulfilled." Something compelled me to turn to the final page, the one that had once predicted Holmes's demise. My breath caught. The page was no longer blank. A new entry had appeared, written in the same meticulous hand as all the others. It read, "The final case of Sherlock Holmes, yet to be written." A shiver passed through me. "Holmes," I began, but when I looked up, he was already watching me, a faint smile upon his lips. "Ah, Watson," he said softly. "Some stories, it would seem, insist upon having the last word." And with that, he returned to his violin, leaving me staring at the page, uncertain whether to turn it or close the book forever. As the last embers of the fire flickered in the hearth, Holmes rested his fingers against his temple, his expression one of quiet contemplation. The ancient book lay closed upon the table between us, its final inexplicable entry lingering in my thoughts. "Holmes," I said at last, "if belief is truly as powerful as you suggest, then was Hawthorne's greatest crime the murder of Sir Reginald, or was it the manipulation of reality itself?" Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke from his pipe. "Watson, a well-crafted illusion is often more dangerous than a blade, for it does not merely deceive the senses, it compels men to act in accordance with a falsehood. Hawthorne's book was never a prophecy, yet it dictated our every step. Tell me, which is more dangerous? The lie itself, or the man who chooses to believe it?" I frowned. "Then you suggest that the true power of deception lies not in the words, but in the mind of the deceived." Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely, my dear Watson. And in that regard, we are all at risk, so long as we accept what is written without question." He reached for the book, his fingers resting upon its cover for a brief moment before he slid it into the fire's glow. The pages curled, blackened, and turned to ash. "Some stories," he murmured, "are better left unwritten." But was the book truly destroyed? Or had its final author already ensured that its story would continue? What do you think was Hawthorne's biggest mistake? Was it underestimating Holmes, or believing too much in his own deception? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, be sure to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes investigations. And if you know someone who would love this story, share it with them. After all, every great mystery deserves a second reader. The game is never truly over. Until next time.